Um, I'm David Morgan, and I'm very glad to welcome you to the first of the Free Association's public lectures. Normally, they're held under the rubric of the political mind at the Institute of Psychoanalysis, but some things are contentious or not so to do with psychoanalysis, so we have them separately under Free Associations, which is what we're doing tonight. I'm going to keep an eye on the numbers coming in. So I'm going to keep doing this for a bit. Okay. So I'm going to introduce our speakers for tonight. The subject, as you all know, is British psychology in crisis, a case study in organisational dysfunction. The editor is David Pilgrim. The contributors include Graham Buchanan, Ashley Conway, Pat Harvey, and David Pilgrim. And they describe the current organisational crisis in the British Psychological Society, one that quite a few of us have been aware of for some time. They offer a critical account of the Society's recent history, which to quote the BPS which to quote from the book, the BPS might wish to hide from public view. And they investigate how the organisation has reached such a parlous state. I think this is of interest for many of us, not just because of the British Psychological Society, but any of us working in similar organisations that I could mention here tonight, that can be equally criticised for their machinations, nepotism, and yes, organisational corruption. Is it possible, I would say, as the chair tonight, which I'll throw open as a question, in a culture that has become more and more about profit over care and altruism, where a crude neoliberal business model has been imposed on all of us and our social and healthcare services to avoid these issues? Can an organisation withstand these pressures not to become part of the problem? So that's the question I'll throw out. But I'd like to introduce our speakers now, which would be David Pilgrim, who's a PhD honorary professor at Health and Social Policy at the University of Liverpool, the visiting professor of clinical psychology at the University of Southampton. He's now semi-retired, although writing lots of books. His career embraced clinical work, teaching, and mental health policy research. He remains active in the division of clinical psychology of the BPS and the history and philosophy section of the BPS, and was chair of the latter. He's author of a number of books, which I recommend to you, including Critical Realism for Psychologists. Roger Bolton has worked on television, our discussant tonight, has worked on television as an editor of Tonight and that great, wonderful program, Panorama. He was then head of the network production for the BBC. He was editor of the equally wonderful program This Week, and was involved with the controversial documentary Death on the Rock that some of you might remember. He then became controller of factual programs for Thames and has also been a radio presenter on BBC Radio 4, so you'll recognize his voice when he starts talking. He was on Feedback for many, 23 years and did a program called Sunday, and now writes a regular blog called Roger Bolton's Beeb Watch, which I recommend to you. They're our speakers tonight. I'm going to now check there's nobody else in the waiting room before I invite David up. No, everybody's here. Good. Okay. Do this. Yeah. Good. Speaker. I'm going to put it on speaker view. I've forgotten how to do now. There it is. Okay. I'm now going to invite David Pilgrim to kick us off tonight, and he will introduce his book and the theme of the talk. David.
Thank you very much, David. Too many Davids in the room, probably. It's an age thing. I'm aware straight away that many people in the audience will not be members of the BPS, but there may be also BPS members who are not clear what's going on in the BPS. So I'm really going to provide a broad brushstroke of what the book was about, where it came from, its main messages, etc. And I'm going to do this in really 4 sections. I wanted to say a bit about the context of the book, where it came from, a little bit about a description of the crisis in the BPS. Then I'll move to some arguments about causation. Why did it get into this mess? And then finally, the Quo Vadis question, BPS, where are you going? Sort of speculation about the future. So 4 sections. Each one will have maybe 3 points in, because I'm aware there's a lot of information in the book. and I can't deal with it all, and I would overload you anyway. You wouldn't take it all in. So I'm hoping just to give you some broad ideas, but I'm more than happy at the end to describe any detail. Also, occasionally I'll mention detail in order to explain the headline, otherwise it wouldn't make sense. Okay. So the context is really November 2020, when a group of us formed BPS Watch. That was myself, Pat Harvey, and Peter Harvey. We were three retired clinical psychologists. We'd had some dealings in a minor way with the BPS. Both Peter and Pat had been chairs of the Division of Clinical Psychology. I'd chaired the History and Philosophy section. And we were getting wind of a number of difficulties in the BPS. We were not journalists. We were not detectives. We were not forensic accountants. And yet the skills of all those three were actually quite important if we'd had them around. But between us, we sort of got going and started to work out what the problem was. And we began really by setting up a blog and a Twitter account. And this book, British Psychology in Crisis, really can be seen as the third major product of our work as BPS Watch. And we began our work, I think, provoked by a couple of child protection questions. The first was in relation to a document that had been produced by the BPS in 2019 called Guidelines on Gender, Sexuality and Relationship Diversity, which we felt had been pushed through without a full consultation with relevant parties. It was very biased, and it was largely evident that it was a product of pressure from transgender activists. The second child protection question that quickly came into play when we were joined by Ashley Conway was to do with a different question, which was the law and memory. And the BPS, over a period of about 10 years, had developed a policy which was narrowly about false positive decision-making and was aligned with the policy of the British False Memory Society. And we felt this, again, was a skewed policy. It represented policy capture. So we have two policy capture questions, both of them relevant to child protection. We then realized, as we poked around, found out about these things, that these were really symptoms of a deeper malaise to do with poor governance in the BPS, which I'll come back to more later. And we began to compile a dossier, which was sent to the Charity Commission, of our concerns with evidence. We also developed relationships with journalists who we fed stories to, and so also took advice from, by the way. We exploited where we could leaks from the BPS in terms of documentation, or people who were prepared to speak to us. And between us, we started to build up a picture. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that early on, our blog was threatened with a cease and desist notice by the legal officer of the BPS because we started to report on the fraud. More on this later. We were also told, our Twitter account was also closed down twice for impersonation by the BPS. Now, this is quite interesting because we were getting an early sense that the BPS was not an open organization. It was reacting very quickly. Bearing in mind, we were just ordinary members, maybe seen as troublemakers, but we were just expressing our democratic right to ask questions and to offer our view publicly. But they were clearly threatened by us to do this. Okay, so that's the broad context of the book. It's part of these three products. I'm now going to move to the description about what are we getting at? What is this crisis? And I'm going to mention three broad headlines. The first was an attack over a 10-year period on the democratic authority of the president of the BPS. The second was evidence of financial mismanagement and corruption. And the third was an evident management culture of contempt for ordinary members of the BPS in a range of ways, which I'll come on to. So let me start with the first one, which is about the attack upon the democratic authority of the president. And I do need to go into a bit of detail here. for those who don't know. So the president is this most senior post elected by the whole membership of BPS. The BPS has got about 65 to 67,000 members. We're not sure how many. But it's the only time once a year when they can all vote for one person to be their head from the membership. Now, this person then becomes the president-elect, and then they join the current president, the president this year. And it was also joined by the vice president, who was the president the previous year. So you have a president-elect, current president, the previous president. It's a triumvirate, if you like. So that's relevant to tell you in detail because I need it to explain what happened. So in 2021, over a 2-month period, all three of them disappeared. All three of them. One, Hazel McLaughlin, resigned before her time for family reasons. The second, who was the vice president, David Murphy, resigned, giving a long explanation on Twitter, which by the way, we reproduce in the book, but you can read it in full, in which he complains about the impossibility of the governance of the BPS, the bloated staff costs, his inability, he felt as president to sign off, as vice president to sign off the budget, and his general disaffection with the internal politics at the center of the BPS. But the most important disappearance was that of Nigel McLennan, who was the president-elect of that year, and he was expelled. And this was during the time of COVID, and he was expelled for allegedly bullying an individual member of staff, who, by the way, he'd never met. The reasons for his expulsion, or the announcement of his expulsion, were put on a YouTube video where the acting chair of the Board of Trustees read out a script explaining that he'd been expelled. This happened before he could appeal the decision, and we protested about this, by the way, and eventually the YouTube video was removed, but the script of it is still present in the Psychologist, so you can still read it. So this was really the most hostile attack, direct expulsion. It was basically a kangaroo court. Now, Nigel himself now has gone on to take legal action against BPS. He's going through an employment tribunal, and he may be also suing them civilly for disparagement. And for that reason, by the way, I lost chapters in the book because for legal reasons, we couldn't put certain things in the book. And so chapters by both Nigel McLennan and Peter Harvey, I had to actually take away, even though they were actually good chapters, they were well drafted, I couldn't use them. So this was the parlor state of the attack on the president's system. Now the president has been reduced to an ambassadorial role. They no longer are allowed to actually chair the Board of Trustees. And the word ambassadorial, I think, speaks for itself. By definition, you can't be a turbulent president or critic if you're an ambassador. So it's really basically the presidential role has been cut down to size by the senior managers. The second headline in under this section is the financial mismanagement and the corruption. Now, we came across in BPS Watch 2 previous scandals which involve senior employees of the BPS leaving, we think with non-disclosure agreements, under a cloud because of corruption. But these stories couldn't stand up. We had plenty of retrospective accounts from people who knew about them, but we didn't use them in the book because we weren't confident in the detail. But it was easy to use the third example, which was that in 2020, the personal assistant to the chief executive was arrested by the police in Leicestershire for fraud. She defrauded the BPS of over £70,000 worth of goods on the credit card of the chief executive. She was eventually sent to trial, and then she was sent to prison for 28 months. I haven't followed this story up, by the way, so I'm assuming that she may well be out now. She'd had previous offences against her, 17 previous offences in 2 other employees, and she'd been to prison previously. And to this date, nobody in the BPS has explained what happened and why, how she was appointed. Because of their fraud, after several months of prevarication, the Board of Trustees decided to suspend the Chief Executive and the Finance Director. The Chief Executive was then sent on gardening leave for 12 months while there was investigation. But basically within the first month of the suspension, finance in the National Lottery Community Fund as a finance officer, where he still works. I've endeavoured to follow that story up, but I haven't got an answer to how that happened, on how he was appointed, and whether he was given a reference, etc. So there's a whole set of dynamics around this this fraud. Eventually, the chief exec came back and is still in post now. That's Saad Bajwa. The circumstances of that remain unclear, and I think the detail of it will only come really into the public view via Nigel McLennan's legal case. I won't say any more about that at the moment. So that's the financial scandal, that's the corruption. The third component headline, I think, is the managerial contempt for ordinary members. During our work in BPS Watch, we've had innumerable communications with lots of different people. People have sent letters of concern and complaint to the chief exec, to members of the board, and the letters have been ignored. Sometimes their complaints have been sent into a broken complaints process and they've never seen the light of day. In fact, speaking personally, I haven't come across a single person in the BPS who has issued a complaint and then has been satisfied with the outcome. But again, maybe people in the audience may disagree with that. Please tell us. But I personally haven't come across anybody who's been satisfied with the complaints process. An example of this contempt was in the Board of Trustees. We had a leak that in 2021, I think it was. So Bajwa, the chief exec, actually went to the Board of Trustees and said that he was getting too many complaints from members and what should they do about it. He actually saw complaints as a problem to be battered away. So I think this reflected a particular attitude. The other thing that I should mention, by the way, is that during this time, at no point did the official outlet of the BPS, which is The Psychologist, the magazine of the BPS, report any of this. So none of this crisis was ever reported. Had it not been for BPS Watch and some really good journalism from Third Sector, but also journalists in the Telegraph and the Times who began to report on this stuff because it was leaked to them, none of this would have been reported by the BPS itself. This again reflected a contempt for the membership. An absolute bottom line for the Charity Commission was that in any charity, members should be kept informed at all times of relevant events. And the BPS leaders failed to do that at all points. This in itself is a scandal, I think. So that's basically a quick tour of the problems in the BPS and its crisis. That's a description. And I want to move on a little bit to, well, you know, how did this come to be? What were the conditions, a possibility in the past that led to these events? And, you know, you can punctuate history at different points, but I think a good place to start here is the 1980s, for reasons I'll come on to. The internal relevance of the 1980s was that in 1988, there was a review of the Royal Charter of the BPS as a charity and a regulator, as it came on to be. Since 1966, when the Royal Charter had been first set up, there'd never been a proper Board of Trustees. There'd never been any independent scrutiny in the BPS. They were always appointed from within. And this represented an important dynamic, which was the emergence of an oligarchy inside the BPS. The same names were recycled over and over again. So there was not an independent Board of Trustees. And in 1988, there was a second bite of the cherry, and they could have done that. But they didn't. They didn't actually at that point say we need an independent Board of Trustees. They simply carried on with status quo. And so the oligarchical tendency continued. Now, This is probably best represented by a president, Ray Miller, in 2006 in an article in The Psychologist. Ray Miller had been one of these recycled names. He was a clear, almost an ideal type example of an oligarch because he described himself as a BPS junkie in the article. He'd been around in the BPS for about 15 years as president, general secretary. He'd been on the board of trustees for 15 years, etc. So that oligarchical tendency was important to mention, and it wasn't fixed. But this is the key thing. In the 1980s, the external context was changing. And neoliberalism, I think, then afforded or unleashed a whole set of processes which interwove after that point. So we got from this a new public management model. So those of you who remember Thatcherism, second Griffiths report, the NHS was to be managed, not administered. So thereafter, the NHS was run by managers, not clinicians. In the university sector, it was run by managers, not academics, etc. And this new public management model, as it's called in the literature, then became normative across the third sector. It just became the norm. And it interweaved a set of factors which all in their own way, I think, have contributed to the culture of the BPS. One of them was consumerism and the sensitivity of managers to actually keep consumers sweet. That was one. Another was a contradiction between marketization and bureaucratization within this model. So on the one hand, there was a great encouragement to marketize, to subcontract, to bring in management consultants to fix problems, to focus on value for money, etc., etc. All the stuff that you will be familiar with in large organizations now. And a normative. Young people probably think there was no alternative. There was nothing before this, but there was actually. But we only know this now. But it also became more bureaucratized. So bureaucrats grew like topsy. Managers themselves grew like topsy. The management class, as it's sometimes called, had been around really since the 1930s, but it was only really after the 1980s that it really took off as a force in its own right in modern liberal democracies. And this was the case in the BPS as well. The difference in the BPS was the tension between the power blocks now was not between the members of the BPS and the new managers, but between the old oligarchs and the new managers. And this is where a sort of Fight Club scenario broke out at the top. This has been around in the last 5 or 10 years, and it's been kept secret from the members, but this power struggle between the new managers and the oligarchs has been part of the dynamic of what's going on. There are other influences in this as well, such as the pushing of identity politics, EDI, etc. So a number of things have interwoven during this period since the 1980s, which is both a failure to have a proper board of trustees internally, but this external context of neoliberalism. Okay, so I've covered the context. I've covered something of a description of the crisis and the causes or the conditions of possibility. I'm now going to move on to what might happen next. Now, this has got to be tentative because, as we know, it's extremely difficult to make predictions in open systems. But there are certain trends and there are certain scenarios which are possible. And I just want to rehearse three important ones. The first is that the people now who've come into the new board of trustees could actually make a radical decision to abolish themselves and have a reset button on the organization and have a proper board of trustees. So what's happened is that with some pressure from the Charity Commission, the old tradition of only having oligarchs on the board of trustees has shifted. And literally in the past year, they've introduced a new independent chair and 3 new independent trustees. Most of the people on the board of trustees, by the way, are still psychologists who are senior names taken from internally, traditionally, that oligarchical tendency I mentioned. But there has been this reform. It's mainly come from, I think, Charity Commission pressure. We don't know how these people were appointed because it's part of the opaqueness of the BPS that you never find out what's actually happening. And so that tendency of oligarchical power, which was then modified by the senior managers, does now have some independent scrutiny. Because before that, really for the last 10 years, the Board of Trustees has been like a boxing ring with no referee. There's been nobody to scrutinise what's going on or make judgments about which side should win or lose. Okay, so that's one possibility. The new trustees could say we need to abolish, we need to hit the reset button, we need to be properly independent, we need to have transparency and scrutiny, and we need to look back on what's gone wrong. Now, it's interesting if you compare the BPS, for instance, with the post office and the scandal in the post office that many of you will know about. Because although people are pretty cynical of the new managers in the post office, at least publicly they're saying, we admit that we've had problems. And it's important now to learn from experience and look back. But basically, the BPS is an organization without a memory. It almost celebrates not having any historical insight into its own problems. We invited David Crundwell, who's the new chair of the board, who was brought in from the outside. We invited him to come along tonight as a discussant, and he declined. In my email exchange with him, he said that he was only interested in looking forwards, not backwards. Many of you will recognize this management trope, drawing a line under the past. We don't want to look back. We want to be positive. It's a sort of Pollyanna, head in the sands, problem approach to management. And maybe others will contribute later and tell us whether this is happening elsewhere, but it's certainly happening in the BPS. And sadly, it looks as though David Crundwell, despite being an independent appointment, seems to have gone native. It just seems to be replicating the old culture. And of course, patterns connect through time and cultures are very stubborn. So I suspect that what might happen instead of that radical reform and radical look back exercise is the second scenario, which will have more of the same. It'll be a traditional British fudge, which is we'll tinker around the edges, we'll do most of the things we've always done and just alter it a little bit and hope it's okay, which is very much, I think, a British tradition of reform, which works sometimes, by the way. But in this case, I think it will be a total catastrophe. Because what's needed now is an honest look back at what's gone wrong and why, in order to give the BPS any sense of survivability. So the third possibility is that it's just going to implode, that the BPS is just going to collapse. Now, this wouldn't be unheard of. In fact, since COVID, a number of charities have gone to the wall, mainly for financial reasons. And this is important because I mentioned the financial crisis earlier. The BPS has lost money for the last 5 years. It's poured hundreds of thousands of pounds into persecuting Nigel McLennan in legal fees. It's had a £6 million change programme initiative, which had no performance indicators, and nobody knows what's happened to it. Nobody's reported from the BPS on the success or otherwise of this £6 million worth of membership fees. So the BPS is in serious financial crisis. A reflection of this was that only last week, there was an announcement that about a fifth of the workforce will now be made redundant in order to balance the books, or at least to claw some money back from costs, because basically they're running out of money. I don't know what's going to happen to that. I don't know who those people are going to be. Probably they will not be the senior managers. I suspect they'll be stripping out lower paid, lower status people in the organization, but we don't know the detail of that yet. So basically, that's where we are. And I've seen some questions coming up, but I can come back to those in discussion, David, because I think I've probably said enough now, and I would really welcome the views of Roger Bolton on what he's heard up to now. So thank you very much to everybody for listening this evening. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to gallery view now to try and create a sort of an open discussion. Thank you, David. That was very thoughtful and moving insight into what's happened to the BPS. Some of us have been aware of this from the outside, but I've never really heard it actually put into articulated so well about what's happening. Roger Bolton, who has worked for the BBC a lot for many years. I'm inviting you now to sort of respond really to David's introduction.
Well, I'm not one for false modesty, but forgive me if I feel pretty inadequate about replying to this, and also that I'm likely to use the wrong language. And my only other experience, I have chaired a trust where I had to reorganize it quite significantly, the trustees, and with a vote constrain a very dominant, very good but very dominant chief executive. So I have some experience in that area. I think the first thing I feel listening to all of this is that there's a fundamental question you need to ask, is whether the society is worth saving. Whether you think that its role that it was set up to fulfill is needed today. And if it is needed, how much you need it, there's always the alternative in the end of setting up a separate organization if you felt it. But I think the first thing to decide, and I don't know the answer to this, of course, is the society worth saving? The second question, obviously, is then, if it is, how you go about it. And it seems to me there's a danger that maybe I could identify in David, in what you said, in that if I was trying to undermine you, what I would probably obviously use the old techniques of talking about, you're aging just like me, you're slightly out of date, etc., etc. And also I would pick up statements you made about transgender and so on. In other words, I would try and divert the conversation on the focus away from the basic issues that you raised, which are essentially about structure, management, accountability, and so on, which are central to everybody, with some of the issues which divide, obviously, the society and divide society as a whole.
Yeah.
And I think to dwell too much on these sorts of issues, transgender issues and so on, is dangerous, and that you may weaken your support because you want to get the support, the widest range of support as you can, even on those who disagree with you on particular points. Again, I think there's a danger, though I find it fascinating, but there's a danger of analyzing in partly political terms what has happened more generally to society and trying to fit this, as it were, the particular problems that affect this society with wider changes in society, because again, then you open a flank to be accused of being left, liberal, whatever it is. All these people who want to avoid facing up to the central issues will pick on these points. It's like when you listen to an interviewer. The best interviewers ask short, pointed questions, and the politicians love interviewers who ask long questions, and they love picking up, not answering the question, of course, but picking up assumptions in the questions. And I think there's a danger in the I suppose it is the campaign that you're about to do, is that you'll open up too many flanks. So I think there needs to be, if you think the society is worth saving, there needs to be a very relatively narrow focus on key questions you need to ask and trying to maximize support amongst the members. Easy for me to say, but I think there's so much I don't understand about the Constitution. I mean, just listening as an outsider, it would seem to me that you're rock solid on the question of, for example, financial corruption, because there's been a criminal case. But also, there are questions to be asked about who discovered that, why wasn't it discovered earlier? But the fundamental question is, why is somebody with a criminal record in this area employed by the chief executive and given access by the chief executive to his credit cards and so on? That's a question of due diligence and competence. Now, presumably, we presume that is the reason why he was suspended for a year. But why was he, why year, and why was he reinstated? And that seems to me a crucial area that is worth putting forward. The second question, which I think need to be focused on, is the role of president and the way in which that role was changed. Now, who changed it? Who had the power to change it? And then the third question is, crucially, is in relationship to the trustees themselves and who appoints them. The problem we've got is, I suppose, is that the first port of call here ought to be the Charity Commission. And the Charity Commission has a mixed and rather patchy record in this area. But presumably it has to be answerable to the public about why it's taken certain actions. So do you have access to the report that the Charity Commission must have written in relation to the society? Have you got, have you looked at the constitution of the society? So has it been changed correctly? Does the Charity Commission think this is then adequate? And the crucial question, as you say, is, are the trustees independent? I mean, my experience is, I say, relatively limited, but when I was chair of a trust, I found the obvious situation was that the chief executive was appointing trustees who would do what he said. It's the classic technique. And he, so we had a big wrestling and of determining this particular instance for external financial advice to be brought in and whatever. And I only became chairman almost by accident because there was a complete falling out between the chief executive and the previous chair who resigned, and nobody else wanted to do the job. But the key question I would like to look at is who appoints the trustees, what are the qualifications, and so on. The other thing that I'm bothered about here and don't understand is that what is the position of the magazine, the newspaper, which essentially this ought to be meat and drink, but you say is utterly silent on this issue, which is baffling. Why that should happen? It doesn't. I mean, what's the financial advantage or the political advantage for the society's paper, the paper to be doing this? That I don't understand. Anyway, so my initial remarks would simply be to be careful about the analysis and the background, to focus more narrowly on certain issues, to target the Charity Commission, then to look at the issues of trustees, and also to hone down a set of concerns that you will think get the widest support, and do not be diverted into an argument about transgender and etc. I mean, can you tell me, I mean, from younger members of the society, have you been able to reach them? Do you think that you are essentially talking in what you're doing to the converted, or are you confident that you have a way of reaching out to all the members of society, and particularly younger ones?
Well, David, a lot of questions there. So would you like to respond?
Yes, I'll try and answer some of them. Let me deal with the last one about the impacts we've had and with whom. Actually, I think for a long time, we were just a small group of like-minded people with lots of people probably of our generation or a little bit younger contacting us. I actually think the mass of the membership of the BPS are passive. We have a very low turnout, for instance, in presidential elections. Most people who join the BPS do so, I think, as a sort of CV tick, then sort of forget it. They pay their fees. But added to which, your point about the psychologist, the reason, Roger, that the psychologist has been silent is that the editor of the psychologist is directly employed by the BPS. He has no independence. And so understandably, like all other senior members of the senior employees, he keeps stum. Now, this has had a terrible impact because it's hoodwinked the members. It's not, the psychologist has never reported a single item. This has relied upon Leicester Mercury journalists at times, literally, local journalists telling people in the BPS what's happening in the BPS, because their own magazine, the BPS, the psychologist, has reported absolutely nothing. So the editor is biddable because he's being paid. It's a bit like Pravda. That's what I feel. It's just a propaganda sheet, the psychologist. You also asked, though, Roger, about you were beginning to think tactically on our behalf. Thank you very much for that. We've had 3 years of thinking about this, and actually we've moved. I think we genuinely started thinking we would be a critical friend and we would help reform the BPS if we made the right decisions. I now think that we've been pretty irrelevant. That's a personal view. I think we've been really good at getting the story out, because the story that the BPS wouldn't tell. I'm less confident we've had any impact as campaigners. Some of us now think we should just encourage the BPS to implode and not reform. I think we've got different motives. But Ashley Conway, by the way, who wrote a great chapter in the book, was in contact with me last week. I don't know if Ashley's with us tonight, but he said, Dave, BPS Watch were a bit like the French Resistance, really. You know, you've scored a few goals, you've blown up a few lines, you've got some messages out, but at the end of the day, the Third Reich was probably going to collapse anyway. And that's an interesting metaphor, that I do think we were like guerrilla journalists, we were activists, we were doing our best to tell the story about what was going on. But ultimately, maybe the BPS is just going to collapse for reasons nothing to do with us. But I think we may all.
Why would it collapse? I mean, one of the reasons it would collapse would be if members stop financially contributing.
Yeah,
that would be the most significant way in which you could bring about the collapse. But is that what you want to do? Because if you want to do that, then you have to find a way of reaching all the individual members directly and making sure they understand, and proposing to them that they cease to affiliate themselves or to pay.
Okay.
That would have if you could do it, a very significant effect. But again, I think you have to work out, do you want to, in the end, is this worth surviving, helping survive? Do you have to think about forming an alternative organization? But if you want to bring the organization to its knees quickly, the easiest way and the simplest way is to get the members to cease to contribute financially. And that creates, of course, massive problems, but it will bring about action. I'm slightly baffled about the charity commissions involved in this reaction to this. And what have you? Will they not entertain directly from you complaints for you? Or when you try and approach them on this issue, how did they respond?
Okay, so we were in regular contact with the Charity Commission, and other people near to us were as well. And we had a good relationship with one person there who did her best to construct a file. We then found, actually, eventually, though, the BPS fell off their agenda. They no longer engaged with it. They did give them feedback. They failed to take them over, because remember, one dramatic aspect of the Charity Commission, they can take over failing charities. They didn't take that step. And basically, the Charity Commission failed, in my view, in that role. It basically just stopped working. So, Roger, I can assure you we were in regular contact with the Charity Commission. The only thing I can surmise is that they may have had an influence in modifying the current Board of Trustees with these new trustees. But as you pointed out, we don't know the answer to that. We don't know why they were appointed and by whom. A lot of that is mysterious, because so much is mysterious. Because it's
Are you sure about the new appointees, for example? Have you written directly to them as individuals, putting forward the evidence you have and asking them for individual responses? I mean, the question is, you talked about the new chair effectively saying, I'm not interested in the past, I only want to look forward.
Yeah.
But of course, as you correctly put forward in this case, unless you correct the faults of the past, the future is doomed. So what efforts, is it possible to approach the new trustees and to meet with them or not? Have you tried this? Have they refused to meet with you?
Thank you. Yeah, we will now take on board that advice. I think it will be worth trying them individually when we can trace them. I suspect they'll hold a party line around the chair, but I don't want to be cynical in advance. But I still keep coming back to this question about whether we're coming to the end of our activity now and whether something else is taking over. I wonder whether there is genuinely a structural collapse of the BPS.
Yeah.
But again, I'd really like to hear other people about this, other BPS members, about what feel they get for this at the moment. Maybe other people could come
How
in.
about the basic question? How about we ask everyone the basic question? Do they think that the BPS is worth saving and you need it, or do you need an organization like it? Because
Okay.
that is the determining factor of everything that followed.
Okay, I suspect the answer would be no, and I'll tell you why I say that, is that there have already been quite large fragmentations. For example, in 2017, the Association of Clinical Psychologists was set up because they took away the message that the bureaucracy was now hopeless, badly governed, and they wanted to represent a smaller tribe, which was clinical psychologists. The same happened with the Association of Business Psychologists. And even earlier than that, the Association of Educational Psychologists was set up in '63. So there have always been these smaller organizations, and maybe that is what's going to happen. But the second point I would make is that maybe unidisciplinary authority and identity is a 20th century phenomenon. Maybe it's past its sell-by date. Maybe in the 21st century, we should not have these individual disciplines because the problems facing humanity require interdisciplinary cooperation. So I do wonder whether in the 21st century, we need these disciplines at all.
Well,
to have
just put up a question,
which
is in order to practice, we have to belong to a professional organization. Now, is that the case?
It's not the case with BPS because for a while they were regulators, but then a third of the membership was then taken away into the HCPC. So the regulation of applied psychologists is not done by the BPS. It's done by another body, which is the Healthcare Professionals
But does that leave a group of people who can't join this new body and are left having to stay within the BPS, simply not because they want to be part of it, but because they have to be a member in order to practice in their area?
Yeah, sure. There's a handful of that. There are some neuropsychologists, for instance, that need validation by the BPS. And there's a new group, which I forgot to mention this, which is our mental health workers who are not psychology graduates, that the BPS have tried to recruit actually for financial reasons to get fees. I don't think they've been very successful from what I hear. We campaigned in BPS Watch. We sent a long document to the Professional Standards Authority saying, do not let the BPS regulate these people because they're not fit for purpose. They're corrupt and dysfunctional. We really laid it on the line. This is like 18 months ago, but they ignored our advice and they gave their blessing to the BPS still being a regulator. It's only a very small regulator, by the way, Roger, for that particular group. So it really, your answer, a structural question is that it's not really a substantial regulator.